Well, there have been times through history where the events of one day, 24 hours, make a huge impact on the world, on all of the succeeding events. December 7th, 1941 is one of those days, a date that will live in infamy. And similarly, June 6th, 1944, D-Day, another very important day in the history of the world. And yet again, September 11th, 2001, had reverberations around the world and down through time that we're still experiencing today. But yet, long before any of those events, there was a day, a 24-hour period that had a much greater impact than any of those three or all three of them combined. It was the last day of Jesus' life. And the events of that day have affected every generation that has lived since and will continue to affect people on into eternity. During this 6 weeks of Lent, we are going to journey with Adam Hamilton. I'm going to be using his book, 24 Hours That Changed the World, about the last 24 hours of Jesus' life before he went to the cross. 24 hours doesn't seem like much, but some of you remember the TV series 24. It was an entire season of TV shows based on one 24-hour period. We're going to talk about that last 24 hours for these weeks of Lent. Now, some people have been critical in the past about the way that I really like context, and I try to bring context in, but I really think it's important. Some scholars have noted that Jesus took probably weeks to travel from Galilee down to Jerusalem for that Holy Week during which he was crucified. And one of the things that I appreciate and love most about Jesus is his amazing courage. He knew what the end of that journey from Galilee to Jerusalem was going to be. He had been assured of what would happen by Moses and Elijah on the Mount of Transfiguration. So there weren't any surprises for him as to what waited for him in Jerusalem. And yet, he did it. In that time, in the weeks that he traveled to Jerusalem, to his crucifixion and death, he must have reflected on his life, on the things that he'd accomplished, and I'm sure that he probably at some point or another thought about the things he could still accomplish if he'd just not go to Jerusalem, if he'd just turn away from that and go off and hide someplace until all the tension blew over. But he knew that he had to go. And yet, with all of that stress that he was carrying in that journey to Jerusalem, he still showed compassion and kindness to the people he met along the way. That really takes something when you're under stress to continue to minister to people, to meet people's needs. There was an article in the Journal Star this past week about Coach Chenander for the Nebraska football team, talking about the way that he doesn't have the luxury of experiencing a lot of worry and stress because he's got the players, the students that he has to worry about and focus on. And that, I think, just gives us an inkling of Jesus. Because it is so hard when you are experiencing difficulties of your own to put all your energy and all your thought into helping those in need that you meet along the way. It took a lot of courage to make that trek, to show kindness and compassion to hurting people while knowing that Jesus' death waited just a few days and a few miles away. Well, eventually the journey was over and Jesus entered Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. Now, I don't know at exactly what point Jesus' murder was inevitable, but I really believe that once he entered Jerusalem, there was no going back. He had a number of encounters, I guess maybe even collisions would be a more appropriate way to talk about it, between himself and the religious leaders. At times like when he cast the money changers and merchants out of the temple, out of that court of the Gentiles, and told them to get out, that the temple should be a house of prayer and not a den of thieves. And that was just one of the encounters that he had. And by Thursday of Holy Week, Jesus knew that he had done all that he could to be faithful to his Father. And so he told a couple of his disciples to prepare the Passover for him in an upper room. And his last 24 hours of earthly life began with that Last Supper. And we're going to go through those 24 hours starting with the Last Supper. Now, the Passover meal, and I believe that last meal together was a celebration of the Passover, because Jesus told them, when they said, "Where do you want us to go prepare the Passover for you?" He told them to go to that at that upper room to follow the guy that was fetching water. And so they were eating together. Now that Seder meal is a great celebration. Some of you have come to some of the Seder meals that we've had in our parish over the years since we've come here, and it's a great time. I mean, there's some good food, there's good fellowship, and you're there with friends and maybe even family, and relaxing and enjoying together and worshiping together. But yet, on that celebration of the Passover, that celebration of Israel's release from slavery, Jesus was troubled and he was sad. And there was a lot of anticipation and I'm sure excitement by his followers, because remember, they were arguing about who was going to sit at his right hand and who would sit at his left hand when he became king. So they were chomping at the bit. And here he was, very sad and sorrowful. And he cut through all of their emotions with that statement, "I tell you the truth, one of you will betray me." I mean, that's kind of like having a big family get-together and celebration. It's the 4th of July. You've just enjoyed a big meal and you're getting ready to enjoy the fireworks, and Grandma or Grandpa says, "Oh, by the way, the doctor says that I've got cancer and I just have a few days to live." Like all the air goes out of everything, right? Jesus said, it's worse than cancer. One of them sitting around the table was going to betray him. They would essentially murder him. And all of the disciples said things like, oh, surely it's not me. You're not talking about me. You're certainly not. Well, we know, looking backward, that Judas, if he said, surely not I, Jesus could say, yeah, you're the one. That's why he gave him the one piece of bread that he dipped in the bowl. And when John asked him, who is it who's going to betray you? But it wasn't just Judas, because if you think about it, Peter denied him 3 times, not just once. And all the rest of the apostles deserted him and ran and hid. Jesus could just as well have said, all of you are going to betray me. And we shake our heads and say, oh my gosh, what a bunch of losers he picked for apostles. They all betrayed him and deserted him and were unfaithful. Until we stop and think and look around us at what's happening in the world. I mean, we see the Catholic Church going through major difficulties with priests who have molested children or church members, and the Catholic Church isn't the only one. Nearly every denomination has had some experience with pastors or leaders abusing members and even children. And it's not limited to sexual stuff. We've got church leaders who have embezzled money. And that's way more common than anybody really wants to admit experiencing. But it happens. And we might shake our heads at them, but instead of playing the ain't it awful game, we really have to stop and admit that the prayer in the Book of Common Prayer should be ours also, when it says, most merciful God, we confess that we have sinned against you in thought, word, and deed, by what we have done and by what we have left undone. There is a very real sense in which all of us have also betrayed Jesus, have deserted Jesus, have abandoned Jesus. So we all share that burden. We all share that guilt. But here's the good news, despite that, despite the fact that Jesus knew what was going to happen, none of that stuff was a surprise to him. He told Peter, you're going to deny me 3 times before the cock crows, right? He knew that was going to happen, and he knew from the scriptures that the shepherd would be struck and the sheep would scatter. He knew that all of the apostles were going to run and hide. And yet, he broke that bread, and he took the cup and he gave it to them when he knew that they were going to mess up. They were going to abandon him and betray him. good news is that even though all of us have betrayed Jesus at some time or another, and maybe multiple times a day, if you consider thought, word, and deed, Jesus still offers us forgiveness, the bread and the cup, to help us remember that he did that for us. You know, that would, if he wouldn't have, think about it, that would just be like if I consecrated the elements at some point and said, okay, the elements are consecrated, now all of you sinners get out of here, I'm only going to serve the good people. All of you who haven't sinned, come forward and you get to take communion, everybody else has to leave. No, it's not that way. Because we understand that Jesus did that for each one of us. Jesus did something else in that Last Supper. You know, the Passover meal is the defining story of the Jewish people, of the nation of Israel, right? Because they had been slaves in Egypt, and they go through that repetition every year. We were slaves in Egypt, but God, through his mighty hand, performed miracles and delivered us from Pharaoh. You know, all of that stuff, they remember it every year at the Passover. And that story of being slaves, God intervening and then being freed and following Moses out into the desert and then eventually following Joshua into the promised land. That story defines them. They know they are God's people by that story. And Jesus, in the Last Supper, gave us a defining story as well. You know, sometimes we forget about that and we let ourselves be defined by another story. We let ourselves be defined by what happened to us maybe when we were growing up. When I was a kid growing up, I was small for my age, always. I'm still small for my age, right? But I was not only small as a little kid, I was sick all the time. My first grade year, if I hadn't had really good grades, I would have had to go back and repeat the first grade because I was, through the winter and early spring, I was sick more than I was in school. It wasn't until later the doctor figured out that our milk cows had a kind of bacteria that I was not immune to, and he said you got to do one of two things: either get a pasteurizer or start buying your milk because it's making this kid sick. But because I was small and sickly and weak, and that combined with being really good in school, some of the kids didn't appreciate it very much. I'd come back from being sick a week and do all my tests and, you know, get hundreds on everything and warp the curve for everybody, and especially some of the older boys bullied me constantly because of who I was, and I could let that anger over the constant bullying define who I am. All of you have things in your background that you could let define you and limit who you are. But instead of that, Jesus has your defining story. Because in the Last Supper, God claimed you. God forgave you blow it. You belong to God. That is your story that defines you. That you are loved by God. There's one other thing that I want to mention, one more takeaway from Jesus' Last Supper with his disciples. We know that we've been forgiven. We know we've been welcomed to the table. We know we've been given a new story because of God's acceptance. But we also, in that Last Supper, have a picture of the kind of community that God wants for us, the kind of community that we were made for. If you only had 24 hours to live, like Jesus did, who would you want around your table? He chose his disciples who had followed him for around 3 years, probably. Who would be around your table? Who are you made for community with? When Gene and I were new Christians, we were part of an adult Sunday school class in our church in Elizabethtown, Kentucky. And in our Sunday school class, there was no single teacher, but it was kind of like a revolving door of teachers. Different people from the class would sign up to teach it, and we had a few people who would come in from the outside and teach occasionally. And there was one Sunday, a man named Bob Bowen, who was our teacher. Now, Bob was about my height, but he probably weighed 3 or 4 times what I did at that time. He was a stout little fella. He talked about years before in his Sunday school class. There was a woman who was told by her doctor that she had terminal cancer. And the members of that Sunday school class immediately signed up, and they took her food every day. Not only did they deliver food to her house, every time they delivered food, they took along a little vial of anointing oil, and just as it says in the book of James, they anointed her with oil and prayed for her. They did that, he said, every day for 2 years. And at the end of that 2 years, the cancer was gone. You know, you can talk about the miracle of that physical healing, but to me, the miracle of a group of people pulling around her and supporting her daily, praying for her daily for 2 years is as big a miracle as the physical healing. That's the kind of fellowship that we are made for. That's the kind of closeness that God wants for us. So during these 6 weeks of Lent, I'm just going to ask the question of you, who is at your table? Who are you going to call to be with you? See, Jesus could have gone through all that alone, but he told the disciples to come in for the Passover meal out in the Garden of Gethsemane that we're going to talk about next week. He asked some of them to stay awake with him, to watch and pray. Turned out they didn't do a real great job of that, but he still invited them. Who are we going to call to share that journey with us during these 6 weeks? My hope is that you don't try to go on the journey to Easter alone. because you're made for community. You're made to have others around your table with you. Please don't journey alone. Thanks be to God for the gift of the Lord's Supper